There is no audio recording from this room. The monitoring system was active. Nothing failed, nothing was deleted, the file simply never appeared. What follows is not a theory. There are no assumptions here, no speculation, only a reconstruction, built from timelines, from system behavior, from recorded decisions, nothing added, nothing removed, nothing more. In the early hours of June 25th, 2009, the house was quiet by design. In the early hours of June 25th, 2009, the house was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Not empty, not abandoned, controlled. This was not a night defined by urgency or disruption. By outward appearance, it followed a pattern that had already been repeated many times before. The property was staffed. The environment was managed. Systems designed to monitor, regulate, and maintain stability were powered and operational. Nothing about the setting suggested that this night would later be isolated, examined, or questioned. It was intended to pass without distinction. Michael Jackson was preparing for rehearsals scheduled later that day. Despite visible strain in the weeks leading up to this moment, the expectation was continuity. The night was meant to resolve itself quietly, allowing the routine to resume in the morning. Inside the residence, everything was arranged to minimize stimulation. Lighting was subdued. Movement was limited. Noise was discouraged. These were not emergency measures, but established preferences. For someone whose life had long been shaped up by schedules, handlers, and constant observation, this controlled calm was familiar. Normality in this context was not the absence of structure. It was structure itself. From a technical perspective, the night began without incident. Power systems remained stable. Environmental controls continued functioning. Monitoring tools confirmed active status. Logs accumulated timestamps that suggested nothing more than time passing as expected. This kind of normality is easy to overlook in hindsight, precisely because it lacks contrast. There were no raised voices, no alarms, no sudden changes that would later demand explanation. The house did not signal distress. This matters because narratives built around final nights often rely on chaos. They begin with tension, with conflict, with warning signs that appear obvious once the outcome is known. This night does not offer that structure. Instead, it offers consistency. Staff members moved according to routine. Responsibilities were defined. Expectations were clear. Systems designed to remain in the background did exactly that. They observed without intervening. They confirmed operation without drawing attention to themselves. In environments like this, silence is not suspicious. Silence is success. The hours leading into the early morning passed without incident. Logs continued to register system health rather than activity. The absence of alerts reinforced the assumption that nothing required attention. Everything aligned with intention. In retrospect, this becomes unsettling, not because anything appeared wrong, but because nothing did. At the start of the night, there was no reason to believe that any part of the system would later be scrutinized. No reason to imagine that silence itself would become the central feature of the record. But systems do not announce their limits when those limits take the form of absence, they simply continue. Official descriptions of Michael Jackson's condition in the days and weeks leading up to June 25th are consistent in tone, but carefully limited in scope. Fatigue is acknowledged, stress is referenced, insomnia is mentioned repeatedly. Yet these terms are presented as manageable conditions, not indicators of imminent collapse. The language is precise but restrained. He is described as exhausted but functional, anxious but cooperative, physically strained, yet still engaged in preparation. This framing establishes a critical baseline: vulnerability without incapacitation, a person under pressure, not a person beyond awareness. This distinction matters because it shapes how the night is interpreted. Sleep in this context is not a simple state. It exists on a spectrum. Rest is not the same as unconsciousness. Sedation is not the same as unresponsiveness. These differences are subtle, but medically and procedurally significant. On the night in question, the goal was rest, not isolation, not withdrawal. Rest as a controlled outcome. Measures taken to achieve that rest were not portrayed as extraordinary, but as extensions of an existing routine. This was not a sudden intervention, it was repetition. Repetition creates familiarity. Familiarity reduces urgency. From the outside, this produces an appearance of predictability. The environment is calm. The intention is clear. The plan is working. And when a plan appears to be working, deviations are harder to notice. What remains largely undocumented is the internal experience of that transition. Monitoring systems cannot record awareness. Logs cannot capture perception. A body can shift from alertness to sedation without leaving a technical trace. This is where the gap begins to form. Michael Jackson was not physically alone that night, but he was isolated in a structural sense, surrounded by systems designed to observe without interrupting, and by people whose responsibilities were segmented and specific. Each role had boundaries, each boundary created distance. In such environments, the absence of complaint is often interpreted as success. Quiet becomes confirmation. Stillness becomes reassurance. But stillness is ambiguous. Medical narratives often rely on endpoints: before and after, conscious and unconscious, responsive and unresponsive. The space between these states is harder to describe and therefore easier to overlook. If awareness faded gradually, there would be no moment that demanded recognition. No single instant where concern replaced routine. The transition would pass unmarked. This matters because systems and procedures are designed to respond to thresholds, not gradients. They react to clear signals, not to slow changes. When a shift occurs without crossing an obvious line, it can disappear into normality. By the early morning hours, the external indicators suggested stability. The environment remained controlled. Systems were active. Silence aligned with intention. Internally, however, that silence could mean many things. Without a record of awareness, without a marker of transition, interpretation fills the void. Calm, sleep, sedation, unconsciousness. These words are often used interchangeably after the fact, but they do not describe the same state. The official narrative depends on continuity, that the night progressed smoothly until it did not, that there was a clear moment when normality ended. But what if there wasn't? What if the most significant change occurred quietly, gradually, without resistance or interruption? What if the systems and the people around them had no reason to register concern until the opportunity to do so had already passed? In that scenario, silence does not signal peace. It signals uncertainty. And uncertainty, once embedded in the record, cannot be resolved by reconstruction alone. The environment was designed to feel controlled without feeling invasive. This was not a space built for performance or surveillance in the traditional sense, but it was structured around quiet oversight. Systems were present, active, and persistent, yet intentionally unobtrusive. Their role was not to intervene, but to remain available. This distinction matters. The residence contained multiple layers of technical infrastructure, each with a narrowly defined purpose. Environmental systems regulated temperature, airflow, and lighting. Power continuity systems ensured that equipment remained operational without interruption. Monitoring tools verified that systems were active, connected, and responsive. Together, they formed an architecture focused on stability rather than redundancy. Not all monitoring systems are designed to record content. Many exist only to confirm state. Power on, signal present, connection stable. These systems do not ask what is happening in a room. They ask only whether the system itself is still functioning. In such configurations, silence is not an anomaly. Silence is compliance. Audio infrastructure within these environments often operates under conditional logic. Recording may be continuous in some systems, but in others it is triggered only when predefined thresholds are crossed. Sound levels, movement, or specific activity markers determine whether data is stored. Below those thresholds, nothing is archived. This creates a critical difference between monitoring and recording. Monitoring confirms presence of a system. Recording confirms presence of an event. On the night in question, the monitoring layer remained intact. Logs confirm ongoing operation. Status checks continued to pass. There is no evidence of power loss, misalignment, or shutdown. From the system's perspective, everything was normal, but normal operation does not guarantee documentation. The environment was optimized for control and predictability, not for capturing every possible state. Silence was treated as acceptable, expected, even desirable. A quiet room aligned with the intention of rest and recovery. This design choice introduces a blind spot. A system built to detect disruption is inherently poor at recognizing stillness. It reacts to deviation, not to compliance. When nothing crosses a line, nothing is recorded. The physical space reinforces this logic. Lighting was subdued, movement was limited, human presence was minimized to reduce stimulation. Every element of the environment supported quiet continuity. From a technical standpoint, this meant that the absence of sound would not generate concern. No alarms would trigger, no alerts would fire, no files would be created to mark the moment. The environment, in other words, was doing exactly what it was designed to do. And that is what makes reconstruction difficult. When systems are designed to observe only what breaks expectation, anything that conforms perfectly to those expectations disappears from the record. Silence becomes invisible. Time passes without leaving evidence. This setup does not imply negligence or malfunction. It reflects priorities. Priorities that assume meaningful events will announce themselves through disruption. What the environment could not account for was the possibility that the most critical transition would occur without noise, movement, or resistance. By the time the night reached its critical window, the systems were still active. The environment remained stable. The architecture of monitoring continued to confirm itself, but the architecture of recording left nothing behind. Irregularities rarely announce themselves. They do not arrive with alarms or warnings, and they almost never appear as clear turning points while they are happening. More often, they surface as details that feel too small to justify attention in real time. On the night of June 25th, the first deviation from routine did not involve a system failure, a sudden noise, or an urgent response. It involved timing. As the hours progressed, the environment remained outwardly stable. Monitoring systems continued to report active status. Power continuity checks passed without interruption. Logs accumulated timestamps that suggested nothing more than systems confirming their own operation. From a technical perspective, the night was unfolding exactly as expected. But normality in controlled environments is not defined by stillness alone. It includes variation, minor changes in sound levels, subtle movement, small indicators that confirm presence rather than absence. These fluctuations are not consciously tracked by systems designed for stability, but they form the background rhythm of an occupied space. At some point during the night, that rhythm flattened. There is no documented moment when this shift occurred, no entry in the logs marking concern, no recorded discussion suggesting uncertainty. The systems did not recognize the change as meaningful because nothing exceeded predefined thresholds. Silence, stillness, and lack of activity remained within acceptable parameters. This is where the first irregularity takes shape, not as an event, but as a condition. A monitored environment can remain technically normal while becoming informationally empty. Systems continue to function, yet capture less and less that reflects the reality inside the room. The absence of variation does not trigger alerts. It reinforces the assumption that the plan is working. From a human perspective, this reinforces patience. If nothing appears wrong, waiting feels responsible. Intervening feels unnecessary. In fact, intervening may feel disruptive to an outcome that appears successful. This dynamic creates a quiet feedback loop. Systems confirm stability. Stability justifies inaction. Inaction preserves silence, and silence continues to be interpreted as normal. What makes this stage difficult to identify in retrospect is the lack of contrast. There is no before and after separation, no moment where normality clearly breaks. Instead, there is a gradual narrowing of what can be observed. The first irregularity, then, is not that something happens. It is that fewer things happen than expected, and no mechanism exists to question that reduction. From this point forward, reconstruction becomes fragile, not because records conflict, but because they agree too well. Every system confirms that it remained active. Every log suggests continuity. Every indicator implies control. Yet control without observation is incomplete. By the time the night approaches its critical window, the environment has already entered a state where meaningful change can occur without being registered. The systems are still on, the logs are still clean, the silence is still acceptable. And that acceptance is the earliest signal that something fundamental has shifted. Time becomes central when content disappears, when there is no recording to examine, no audio file to replay, and no visual documentation to anchor events. Time itself becomes the only remaining structure. Minutes begin to matter, gaps become visible, not because something dramatic happens within them, but because nothing can be confirmed. In this case, attention repeatedly returns to a narrow window in the early morning hours. Approximately 3:17 a.m. This timestamp is not presented as the moment something definitively occurred. There is no alarm associated with it, no log entry marking a failure, no sudden change in system status. It matters because it sits precisely at the boundary between continuity and absence. Up until this point, the environment appears stable. Monitoring systems remain powered. Logs continue to confirm operation. There is no record of shutdown, interruption, or emergency response. From a technical perspective, the night is proceeding exactly as designed. But around this window, the narrative begins to thin. What follows is not a documented event, but a documented lack of one. No audio artifact is associated with this period. No fragment, no partial file, no placeholder indicating that something was captured, but unusable. The absence is complete. This distinction is critical. Silence that is recorded still leaves a trace. A waveform exists. A file is created. Even an empty recording can be measured, time-stamped, and verified. Here, there is no such evidence. What appears to be missing is not content, but the file itself. This raises a technical question that cannot be ignored. Was audio recording inactive, or was it never configured to engage under these conditions? If the system was designed to record only when specific thresholds were crossed, sound levels, activity markers, or predefined triggers, then a quiet room would produce no output. The system would remain active. Status indicators would show normal operation, logs would continue to accumulate, and yet nothing would be archived. In that scenario, nothing fails. But that explanation carries its own weight. It assumes that silence was expected, that quietness was considered acceptable, that no one anticipated the need for documentation during this interval. The 3:17 a.m. window matters because it represents a last moment where continuity can be asserted without qualification. Before it, systems confirm activity. After it, reconstruction depends entirely on external observation and later interpretation. There is no log entry that marks this transition, no alert that identifies the silence as unusual. The systems do not recognize the absence of sound as a condition requiring attention. This is not an oversight, it is a consequence of design. Systems built to detect disruption are often blind to stillness. They respond to noise, movement, deviation. They do not respond to quiet compliance. Silence, when it aligns with expectations, becomes invisible. As the minutes pass through this window, nothing calls attention to itself. The room remains undisturbed. The systems remain active. Time advances without friction. This is what makes the moment so difficult to reconstruct. There is no pivot point, no sharp edge, no clear before and after, only a gradual narrowing of what can be known. Later accounts attempt to anchor significance to this time, but significance is assigned retrospectively. At the moment itself, there is no indication that anything has crossed a threshold. The systems continue to function. The room remains silent, and no file appears to bridge the two. From this point forward, the night can no longer be examined directly. It can only be inferred. The absence becomes the artifact, not something that was removed, but something that never entered the record. The 3:17 a.m. window does not offer answers. It offers a boundary, a line beyond which certainty dissolves, and silence becomes the only consistent feature left behind. When a recording is missing, attention naturally shifts to logs. Logs feel authoritative. They are time-stamped, sequential, and technical. They appear to offer certainty where narrative does not. But logs do not describe reality. They describe what a system believes about itself. In this case, the most striking feature of the available logs is not contradiction, corruption, or absence. It is consistency. Power systems report continuity. Monitoring tools confirm active status. Time advances without interruption. There are no error codes, no shutdown flags, no anomalies that demand investigation. On paper, the environment remains controlled from start to finish. This apparent completeness gives the illusion of coverage, but logs are not neutral observers. They are selective by design. They record predefined conditions, not lived experience. They confirm whether a system is running, not whether that system is capturing something meaningful. A monitoring system can be fully operational while recording nothing of value. It can report active while its inputs remain empty. Status checks pass even when the most critical data never enters the archive. This distinction becomes crucial when the missing element is not a damaged file, but a file that never existed. In many systems, silence still generates data. A waveform is created. A file is stored. The absence of sound becomes evidence of absence. But in threshold-based architectures, silence produces nothing. No trigger is crossed, No output is generated. The system remains active, yet leaves no trace. From the outside, both situations look identical. No usable recording. From the inside, they are fundamentally different. One confirms that nothing happened. The other confirms only that nothing exceeded expectation. The logs in this case point toward the second condition. They show systems operating normally while providing no insight into what occurred within the monitored space. They document health, not content, stability, not presence. This is why the logs feel both reassuring and unsettling. They suggest order, but they refuse to answer the most important question: what was happening while they were confirming themselves? There is no indication of deletion, no evidence of tampering, no signs that data was removed after the fact. Deletion leaves artifacts, audit trails, file system inconsistencies. Here, there is only absence. This absence is technically correct. The systems did what they were designed to do. They confirmed uptime. They verified connectivity. They ignored what did not cross a line. Later, when the night is reconstructed, this becomes a problem. Logs are treated as witnesses, but they were never meant to testify about events. They testify only about their own condition. When investigators, analysts, or observers look to the logs for clarity, they find order instead. Order that resists interpretation. Order that suggests control where none can be confirmed. The logs do not contradict one another. They simply agree to remain silent. When systems fail to produce a record, responsibility does not immediately shift to error. It shifts to people. Not because people provide certainty, but because they create sequence. In the absence of data, human decisions become the only visible structure left behind. In controlled environments, roles are narrowly defined. One person monitors, another administers, another coordinates. Each role has limits. Each limit is designed to reduce risk, but together they can create gaps where no single individual feels authorized to intervene. This is not dysfunction, it is structure. On the night in question, silence was not interpreted as danger. It aligned with intention. Rest was the goal. Quiet was expected. The absence of disturbance suggested success rather than failure. In that context, intervention would not have felt preventative, it would have felt disruptive. This is how reasonable decisions accumulate. When no alarm sounds, waiting feels responsible. When systems report normal operation, hesitation feels justified. The absence of urgency becomes evidence that urgency is unnecessary. Human attention follows signals, and when systems are designed to ignore silence, people tend to do the same. This creates a subtle transfer of authority. Responsibility shifts from judgment to infrastructure. If something were wrong, the system would indicate it. If no indication appears, then the safest action is inaction. But systems do not recognize ambiguity. They recognize thresholds. As time passes without interruption, silence becomes normalized. Each minute that passes without incident reinforces the belief that nothing requires attention. This is not neglect, it is pattern recognition. The problem is the pattern recognition works only when the pattern itself is reliable. Later, when the night is reconstructed, these moments of waiting are often reframed as failures, but in real time, they are rarely perceived that way. They are pauses that feel justified by context, by routine, and by the absence of contradictory information. No one decision stands out as decisive. There is no clear point where action was obviously required and withheld. Instead, there is a sequence of small, reasonable choices that align perfectly with the system's expectations. This is what makes human factors difficult to evaluate after the fact. Responsibility becomes diffuse. Intent dissolves into process. Cause and effect blur. By the time concern becomes explicit, The window for prevention has already closed. What remains is analysis, not action, interpretation, not intervention. The absence of a record magnifies this effect. Without documentation, human memory fills the gaps. Accounts converge around outcomes rather than moments. Certainty hardens where ambiguity once existed. But the critical decisions did not happen in moments of clarity. They happened in moments that felt ordinary. Moments shaped by trust in systems, adherence to roles, and the belief that silence meant everything was proceeding as planned. That belief was never challenged, and because it was never challenged, it shaped the night more powerfully than any single action could have. Silence in technical systems is not a single condition. It has categories. It can be captured, ignored, filtered, compressed, or dismissed entirely depending on configuration. Understanding this distinction is essential because the anomaly in question does not revolve around sound. It revolves around how sound is treated when it is absent. In audio systems designed to record continuously, silence still produces data. A waveform exists even when nothing is said. The file may appear empty to a listener, but it can be measured, time-stamped, and authenticated. Silence becomes proof that nothing happened. But in systems designed around thresholds, silence is not evidence. It is a non-event. If recording is triggered only when certain levels are crossed, movement, sound amplitude, activity, then silence produces nothing at all. The system remains active. Status indicators remain normal. Logs confirm operation, but the archive stays empty. This creates a technical paradox. From the outside, the system appears to function perfectly. From the inside, it produces no artifact of the moment that later becomes critical. The silence at the center of this case behaves like the second type. There is no corrupted file, no truncated clip, no placeholder indicating an empty capture. There is simply nothing where something might be expected. This is why the question of deletion is misleading. Deletion leaves traces, metadata inconsistencies, file system gaps, audit logs. Here, there is no sign of removal, only absence. Technical silence does not imply malfunction. It implies design choice. And design choices are made with assumptions. Assumptions about what matters. Assumptions about what should be captured. Assumptions about what constitutes an event. In this environment, sound was not treated as inherently significant. It was treated as conditional, only meaningful if it crossed a threshold, only worthy of storage if it justified the cost of attention. This means the system could not distinguish between a quiet room and a critical one, unless noise intervened. By relying on silence as a signal of normality, the system effectively masked the most important moment of the night. Not through failure, but through compliance. The silence was technically correct. And because it was correct, it left nothing behind. When records are missing, explanations multiply. Some are grounded in design, others emerge from discomfort with an uncertainty. The absence at the center of this case invites both, and it is important to separate what can be supported from what simply feels plausible. The most conservative explanation is technical. The system was active but not configured to record silence. No thresholds were crossed, no file was created. In this view, nothing unusual occurred from the system's perspective. The absence of data is the expected outcome of normal operation. This explanation is clean. It requires no error, no intent, no failure. It aligns with the logs. It preserves the integrity of the technology. But it also raises an uncomfortable implication that the system was incapable of recognizing the most critical state precisely because it was quiet. Another explanation focuses on human interaction, that someone assumed silence equaled rest. that no one felt authorized to interrupt, that the absence of alerts reinforced inaction. In this view, the gap is not technological, but procedural. Then there are explanations that sit between the two: misconfiguration, partial monitoring, systems designed to observe conditions, not people. Each suggests that the silence was real, but the architecture surrounding it was incomplete. What these explanations share is restraint. None require deletion, none require concealment, none require conspiracy. More speculative interpretations exist, but they do not add clarity. They attempt to replace absence with narrative, to fill a technical gap with meaning. The problem with such approaches is not that they are impossible, but that they are unnecessary. The silence does not need embellishment to be troubling. What remains unresolved is not what happened, but what was knowable at the time. The systems did not capture the moment. The people did not recognize it. The logs do not contradict one another. Everything aligns, except with what we wish had been preserved. This is the nature of competing explanations when evidence is incomplete. The most convincing answer is often the least satisfying one: that nothing broke, that nothing crossed a line, that the silence fit perfectly within the system's expectations. And because it fit, it disappeared. What remains, once the systems are examined and the explanations are exhausted, is not an answer. It is a residue, a shape defined less by evidence than by its absence, a silence that cannot be replayed, rewound, or verified, because it never entered the record in the first place. There is no final timestamp that resolves a night, no recovered file that clarifies what occurred during the critical window, no overlooked archive waiting to be discovered. The record ends exactly where the system's design allows it to end, without recognizing absence as a condition worth preserving. This is the central discomfort of the case. The technology did not fail dramatically. It functioned according to specification. People did not act with obvious intent or malice. They followed procedures that felt reasonable in real time. Every component behaved as expected, and yet the outcome is a gap that cannot be closed. In the aftermath, official narratives move forward quickly. Medical conclusions provide endpoints. Legal frameworks impose structure. Timelines are drawn, reports are finalized, and the night is assigned a conclusion. But these processes do not replace what was never captured. They move around it. The silence remains external to them. What makes this absence persist is not suspicion, but limitation. A limitation of monitoring systems that privilege disruption over stillness. A limitation of procedures that treat quiet as confirmation. A limitation of certainty itself. In environments built around control and observation, there is an implicit promise that important moments will announce themselves, that alarms will sound, that records will form, that evidence will exist. This case quietly breaks that promise. It suggests that the most critical transitions may occur without noise, without resistance, and without any signal that would register as abnormal. A system can remain active while awareness fades. A room can remain undisturbed while urgency grows. A night can proceed exactly as planned until it no longer can. What remains, then, is not a mystery demanding resolution, but a lesson embedded in absence, a reminder that technology documents only what it has been taught to recognize, that procedures protect only against the risks they anticipate, and that silence, when it aligns perfectly with expectation, becomes invisible. The missing file is not proof of concealment. It is evidence of a boundary, a line where documentation ends and inference begins. Once that boundary is crossed, certainty dissolves. What replaces it is interpretation, shaped by context, by hindsight, and by the knowledge that something essential was never archived. This is not a story about what happened inside the room. It is a story about what could not be recorded, and that absence, unmarked, unflagged, and technically correct, is what ultimately remains.